So tonight, Carter Urnes will be our speaker, and the title of his talk is Insects in the Olympics. He will describe the research he's done to characterize the distribution, phenology, and plant associations of a variety of insects. He's been very busy. He is a field biologist and ecologist who was born in Port Angeles. He started working in the backcountry of the Olympic National Park in 2011 and completed a master's degree in marine science at Western Washington University in 2021. He has studied many organisms, including sea stars, songbirds, salmon, and butterflies. He's now working on a book on the historical ecological change on the Olympic Peninsula. Tonight, Carter will discuss some of the species he has observed and his priorities for future surveys. He'll also discuss the use of iNaturalist for organizing insect observations. So thank you so much for being with us tonight, Carter.
Yeah, of course, it's my pleasure. And I'll just, as a brief anecdote, say that the whole reason that I started this work is I watched a recorded Washington Butterfly Association talk and realized that there was such a rich community of folks involved in studying and looking at insects in our area. So that's really what started me was one of your meetings.
Yay,
So
Sylvia, for putting them online, making them all accessible. So yeah, thanks for those props.
So here I go. Just share my screen. Can everybody see that?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep. Perfect. So my name is Carter Urnes. I also go by CJ sometimes. So if I say CJ, don't get thrown off. It's either Carter or CJ. Both work fine. And tonight I'm going to be talking about some research I've been working on in the Olympics, survey of the insects of Olympic National Park. So as Paulette mentioned, I was born in Port Angeles. I grew up in the Olympic Mountains playing, and I was very lucky to start working in the backcountry of the park as a field biologist immediately after high school while I was still going to college. So since then, that was in 2011, since then I've rotated through a number of different roles, and most of them have been focused on the backcountry of the Olympics. Paulette just mentioned a lot of these, but my intent in my career has been to put together the pieces of the ecology of the Olympics in order to better understand how the entire system works together, rather than specializing in one very, very specific question or specializing in a role and bouncing around to different parks. My goal for my research and my goal as an ecologist is to just be really, really good at one thing, which is the Olympic Mountains. So with that said, I want to make very clear that I'm not an employee of Olympic National Park right now. I've worked for them as a seasonal field biologist. So that's just in the summers. And the research I'm presenting today was conducted under my own research permit, not associated with the work I did as an employee of the park. And the views that I'm expressing tonight are my own, and they don't reflect the opinion of the park or any other organization. So I wouldn't want to, I don't want to conflate. This is my personal research, and I conduct it alongside my passion for working in the park. But this is my own work, and it speaks for itself. So tonight I'm going to talk about a little bit about the Olympics. They're a fascinating area, and I love to study them. I'm going to talk about my project goals, my methods, and my results, and go through a few species that I was particularly fascinated by during this work. And I'll end by discussing how I used iNaturalist, and I think how it could be of great use to all of us who look at insects in our free time or in our professional work. So the Olympic Mountains are west of Seattle. This map highlights the boundaries of Olympic National Park. It forms the center of the range, The boundaries of Olympic National Park encompass the middle of the Olympic Peninsula. It's about 1 million acres, including a coastal strip, and it's surrounded by more than 600,000 acres of national forest. So together, they make this enormous area of relatively undisturbed habitat for native species. And as I grow older and I do more thinking about this, the Olympics becomes more and more special, in that I really don't think I've found anywhere in the world that is as undisturbed and as protected as it is now. I mean, I would say it's likely to remain highly protected for many years to come. So it becomes more and more fascinating to me the more I work on it. One of the most dramatic things about the ecology of the Olympics is this extreme rain shadow. This has been discussed widely before. You've probably heard about this, but storms coming off of the Pacific Ocean they travel to the northeast across the Olympics largely. That's because most of our rain in the Olympics comes during these atmospheric river events that transport moisture from the subtropics from the south. So the western slopes of the Olympics have just this huge amount of precipitation, and the northeastern slopes of the Olympics, they're cacti, native cacti that grow in Squamon and the San Juans. So you get this I mean, that rain shadow, I may have just said this, it's one of the most dramatic rain shadows on Earth. So it's very extreme. This is a map of precipitation, if I didn't mention that. This is a map of elevation. So my intent here is to just show is to show these river drainages that flow out of the center of the range. So my friend makes the analogy, he calls it the water wheel mountains. So you have this precipitation gradient across the Olympics, and then you have rivers like the spokes of a wheel that go around the peninsula. And every one of those river drainages has its own character, its unique character, species associations, plant communities. So to work in each of these drainages, in turn, you really get a sense for how, I mean, it's like cranking a dial on these abiotic factors. And as I have learned to kind of distinguish these different areas, and I've spent more time in each of them, that's just endlessly fascinating too, is that you can change so much going from the Elwha River to the Solduck River, and from the Solduck to the Bogachiel. These things, every single drainage just has a totally different character. One other thing that I want to mention about the elevation of the Olympics is that they're quite low, and there's not very much elevation for organisms to go to, as climate changes and many organisms are going to be moving to higher elevations. So this is a topic that I'm trying to become as knowledgeable as I can about. Pardon me if I gloss over anything or if I mischaracterize anything, but the biogeography of the Olympics is just incredibly fascinating to me, and I don't feel like it's well understood. I don't think that that's controversial to say. The biogeography of the Olympics has an enormous amount left to be studied and understood about it. Some of the highlights here are there's a very high number of disjunct and endemic species. It has a disproportionate amount of endemic species relative to its area in the state of Washington. That's been well studied with plants. But there were some very general heuristics about the distribution of these endemics, like in general, the Northeastern Olympics has a high number of endemic and endemic species. So this map is taken out of a paper by Dan Gavin, who's one of the prominent researchers of endemism in the Olympics and Olympic biogeography. So these different colored squares correspond to how many endemic species are present in each of these locations. And as these squares show, there's kind of this pocket of endemics in the northeastern Olympics that corresponds to what's theorized to be an ice-free zone at the foot of the glacier. In this map, the purple is showing the presumed extent of the last glacial maxima, and that there was this ice-free area in the northeastern Olympics that harbors this high number of endemic species. There is a problem with that though, which is that the northeastern Olympics are the only part of the peninsula which you can drive, or excuse me, the only part of the Olympic wilderness that you can drive a car into and sample easily and get back to your hotel room and go back into town for dinner. So there's this disproportionate sampling effort in the northeastern Olympics. I don't dispute that this area really is special and does have a high degree of endemism. But really, I was fascinated. If you'll allow me this brief anecdote, I worked with an extremely skilled botanist. And every time we would work in the backcountry, he would turn up new county record, new record for the peninsula, new record for Washington. He was such a strong botanist that everywhere he went in the backcountry, he was turning up these notable species. And it was really inspiring to me and hammered home this idea that, really almost nobody's done work in the middle of this range. It's so hard to get to that the number of people who've been to the center of the park at all is very low. And certainly the number of people who've been there who are true experts is much, much smaller.
May I ask a question, Carter?
Of course, yeah.
Allison is asking if this is plant endemism or if this is other things as well.
Yeah, the paper that I pulled this out of by Dan Gavin, it includes all endemic species and all endemic taxa, so not just plants.
So flora and fauna.
Yeah. However, there is and this trend is most well discussed relating to flora. And I especially enjoy Nelsa Buckingham's work, The Plants of the Olympic Peninsula, which has a fantastic introduction discussing biogeography of the Olympics and endemism. And that text is now several decades old. So that was a big motivator for me to look at this more again. So yeah, this map includes includes not just plants, but everything. Just one more note on this is that the paleoclimate research that informs these ideas about biogeography is still ongoing. The extent of the ice flow on that map is theoretical. It's ground truthed in many locations, but we don't really know some of the more complicated trends about ice-free areas, the extent of ice. There are fascinating things to me, like this theory that the sea level during the last glacial maximum would have been over 100 meters lower than it is today. And I don't want to speak out of turn or about something. I'm certainly not a geologist or a climate scientist, but I think it's fairly well supported that the sea level was far, far lower, and it would have exposed enormous areas of low elevation land to the west of the peninsula during the last glacial maximum. And we can only theorize at what the plant and animal communities that lived in those areas are. So there's things like that are just, the research is ongoing. There's still so much to be known. It's relatively understudied. It's so exciting as an ecologist to think about what there is left to learn here. So when it comes to insects, I would say that they're particularly poorly studied. There have been some research projects focused on the Olympics. In In the 2000s, a survey was conducted on butterflies and moths, but that focused on Hurricane Ridge and Blue Mountain, just the two sites in the northern part of the park that you're able to drive to. There's also some studies of benthic macroinvertebrates in the Elwha having to do with dam removal. If you're aware of further studies relating to the insects in the backcountry of the park, please let me know, and I apologize if I glazed over any notable works. But my intent here is to emphasize that really there's very few, and there certainly has never been a comprehensive survey of the insect communities within the park. Although the presence of many species has obviously been documented in the park, and many people are aware that specific species occur there. It's just a research project has never been undertaken that would comprehensively describe what insects live in the backcountry of the park. And that might be obvious that why that would be. It's difficult to fund that sort of work. It often falls on academics. The Park Service systems of funding are not set up generally to support basic science that just seeks to characterize something like that. It tends to fall on academics or on volunteers, especially when it comes to butterflies. It feels like it's a lot of work is left to enthusiasts, and it's difficult to find support for. I think this is kind of preaching to the choir, might be the expression, but I wanted to make note of how important the study of insects is in these communities. So this great proponent of insects, Doug Ptolemy, the University of Delaware, he says, insects are the little things that run the world. And they really are. Insects are this linkage between the plant communities and the animal communities, and their importance cannot be overstated. Doug Ptolemy brings up this incredible statistic that he observed a pair of chickadees bringing caterpillars back to their fledglings in their nest. And these were Carolina chickadees. This was conducted on the East Coast. He observed that they brought back a caterpillar to their fledglings once every 3 minutes. And this seemed to be consistent throughout the period of time when he observed the nest. So extrapolated out, these birds were bringing back 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars per nest of chickadees in order to fledge those young, in order to fly out of the nest and feed on their own. That's an enormous amount of caterpillars, and not the sort of thing that you can come across easily, right? In order to support a single nest of breeding birds, it's going to take a huge amount of insects. This is obvious from what we know about food chains and food chain trophic levels, but just putting that idea, like trying to think about what 9,000 caterpillars looks like, it was very impressive to me and very meaningful. The insects are the primary food source for 70% of songbirds globally, and caterpillars provide a disproportionate amount of that food because they're high in protein. So this science is gaining momentum as we speak and recently, but it's brought a new level of attention and importance to caterpillars, kind of piggybacking off of the very obviously very exciting and this passion for studying birds all around the world. I think there's a renewed interest in studying insects and seeing how they relate to birds. And this is a little bit of just a special treat for myself mostly, is I'm including this picture of this three-toed woodpecker that I observed up the Elwha this summer. Three-toed woodpeckers are rare in the Olympics. They're very difficult to find because they only live in burned areas, and they live in burned areas where they flake off the bark from burned trees, looking for beetles that are living underneath the bark. And so it's this example of this sort of beautiful, complex system where you need forest fires to create dead trees that support these grubs that then can support this disjunct population of three-toed woodpeckers in the Olympics. So this is really interesting system. You don't get the three-toed woodpeckers without the fires and the caterpillars that come after the fire. Excuse me, the larvae that come after the fire. And I don't mean to go overly in depth to this again. I'm sure everybody knows how important insects are, but some plants are especially valuable to insects, that's also should be obvious to this group. But only 14% of native plants support 90% of caterpillars in a study that I looked at. And that study had this line: birds disproportionately forage on trees that have the highest potential to support caterpillar richness and prey biomass. Obvious that birds would prefer to hang around places where it's easy to get good food to eat. But this is exactly the sort of question or idea that just hasn't been studied at all in the Olympics. Like, where are these places we can go to in order to find these disproportionate insect communities that then are especially important to breeding birds that live there? So this like ecosystem energetics, there's something about this that I really want to focus on in my work in the future is how can we figure out how to make, how to sustain insect populations in order to sustain breeding birds that no longer live on the peninsula. So one of those is the western meadowlark. Meadowlarks bred on the peninsula as recently as the early 1990s. And they no longer breed on the peninsula. They haven't been documented here breeding since then, although they passed through. And one of the main reasons is because, or it's suspected that the reason is there is a lack of these grasshopper communities that are their main food source during the breeding season. It's a similar story with the Vesper sparrow, which is a state-listed species and also formerly bred on the peninsula, no longer breeds in the peninsula, likely because of habitat change that has removed these insect populations. So I ended up saying to myself, somebody should do something about this, right? That was just kind of, and I didn't take me very long to think that with my skill sets and my personal interests, I was the person that needed to do this work. Nobody else was going to be able to go out there and do it for me. So what exactly did I do? Does anybody have any questions about that before I keep going?
I think we're good for now, but I did have a question about the 14% of native plants that support caterpillars. Is that plant species or numbers? And do they fall into a particular characteristic set?
Yeah, I'm regretting as I went through that slide, I thought, oh my goodness, I should have I didn't include my source here. My recollection is that the plants that disproportionately support insects that's based on species of plants, or maybe even like genuses, groups of plants, and that there are some plants that are especially valuable as food. And to speak off the cuff, I apologize. I don't have that reference right at hand. I don't remember what that came out of. It was something that Douglas Ptolemy pointed me to, but things like willows are just far more, deciduous trees in general are just far more valuable as forage to the most of the insects that support bird populations than coniferous trees are. So there are some things that when we think about native plants, they're not all created equal, and there's some native plants that are going to be especially important for supporting native insect populations.
Okay, Regina points out that she's run an article in our newsletter before on which native plants support a disproportionate number of bugs. So,
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah. So thank you, Regina.
So my goals with this project were to record the species distribution, the abundance, and the host plants of insects in the Olympic Mountains, in Olympic National Park in general. So I was very interested in common species, the web of species that ties communities together. And I was also interested in rare and endemic species that might not be, supporting nesting songbirds, but were extremely important when it comes to understanding biogeography and the biodiversity of the Olympic Mountains. I really wanted to identify locations of particular importance for future monitoring. It was my hope that this work would be get the ball rolling for other people to focus more on the Olympics and to hopefully generate some institutional interest through Olympic National Park to try and do more monitoring of these species in the backcountry. And I have worked for the park for so long that I really do feel strongly about working with the wilderness in mind. Like, wilderness is a complicated idea, and it has certainly some aspects of it that are challenging and complex. But I wasn't going to be lethally sampling in the backcountry as much as I could help it. I wasn't going to be lethally sampling at all unless somebody reached out and had a specific in a specific project in mind for that specimen, something like sequencing that I could be helpful for. But in general, I wanted to non-lethally characterize the diversity and the behaviors of the insects in the backcountry. So I did this by conducting visual encounter surveys. I wanted to find as many species as possible in as many locations, and I especially wanted to see unique things that were known to be in the Olympic Mountains in order to better understand those. I took photographic records. I took as high quality photographs as I could of these species, and I recorded them in iNaturalist. I used iNaturalist as a database of sorts. So instead of going to the trouble to set up a system for organizing my data, system just for me, I realized that iNaturalist is just such a strong tool for organizing observations of this type. And it just lets you do so many amazing things working with your data that I didn't really see it. Of course, it's a fantastic citizen science tool, but it's an extremely valuable research tool for something like this, where I have an enormous amount of photographic records. They all have metadata associated with them, and iNaturalist just keeps that all in one place and makes a very tidy package with it. So it's perfect. And I didn't include as many survey methods as I had hoped, but in the future, I'm going to talk more about my future plans, and hopefully I'll add more survey methods in the future. So this is like my favorite photo in the whole talk. I love this. So the type of visual encounter surveys I did, it's I hesitate because it sounds a little unscientific, right? I just walked around with the camera and took as many pictures of butterflies as I could. But in talking with other researchers and thinking about this work, my intent is just to get the ball rolling, right? I just want to generate momentum to support future surveys and to design future survey objectives. So with that in mind, I just cared about seeing as many things as I could and generating as many high quality records as I could. So the best way for me to do that wasn't like Pollard Walk. It was to just walk around with the camera and try and get to as many important places as possible and just take as many great photos of different organisms as I could. So that's to say, this isn't a comprehensive survey. It's not a quantitative survey. It has some very obvious bias associated with it. But my intent is to just see as many things out there as I could and to generate the records to follow up on in the future. So as I started to do this work, I focused disproportionately on butterflies. And and it's obvious why. That they're the most charismatic and well-studied group of insects. Although my intent in the beginning was to characterize as many different types of insects in general as I could, I just found that I had a lot more traction and a lot more support looking at butterflies, and so I focused the majority of my work was on butterflies in this project. So I conducted monitoring in 2023 and 2024 in the summer. I did opportunistic surveys whenever my schedule and the weather allowed for it. In each of those years, I had about 20 days that I went out specifically for surveying insects. So those would be days when I thought, we're doing a special trip. We're going to Anderson Pass. We're going to Aurora Ridge. I'm picking out a location that I know nobody's sampled before. It's hard to get to, and there could be anything up there, So I had 20 days about in each of those years when I was going out specifically with a mission in mind. I had 20 more days a year when I was more generating sampling notes and not really a formal survey because I wasn't doing timed surveys. I wasn't noting the air temperature or my route or taking good notes the entire time. I was doing different work in the backcountry of the park, and I would see a beautiful insect. I would take a photo of it, and that would also become a record. So I had about 20 other days when I was generating records even more casually than on my survey days. So I had 2024, I had 786 observations that went into iNaturalist. At this point, 342 of those are research grade, which means other people have collaborated with me to assist in identifying these observations, or they've agreed with my identification. I had a little bit more in 2023. I had 859 observations. And I think it's exciting that I found research grade observations of 135 species throughout the park. This chart shows kind of how those observations broke down into the different groups of insects. When I made this chart, I was actually using observations from before 2023 as well, so it has about 300 more observations in it than the previous slide. But my intent here is to just show how it broke down. It was almost all Lepidoptera. It was almost all butterflies, right? While I did look at some Hymenoptera, I really loved when I encountered Coleoptera. My methodology was these visual encounter surveys, and so I didn't set up like the pitfall traps or sheep beating. I just didn't do these other survey methodologies that you really need in order to accurately characterize these other groups. So the distribution of organisms that I saw, it was strongly biased towards Lepidoptera. I am going to go to my iNaturalist page at the end, I think, and we can look around at kind of some of the areas I looked at and what I saw. So I'll move now into just talking about a couple of these species that I got. I was really taken by and fascinated by. So one of those was the Vidler's Alpine. And in 2023, I spent the entire summer looking for this butterfly and not finding it. It took until my last sampling trip of the summer when I saw one, and it flew past me at 1,000,000 miles an hour and went straight over this gigantic cliff. And that was the only one I saw in 2023. And it was so frustrating. And in 2024, maybe I did my homework better, or I was just lucky. But I had 7 observations of them this summer, and they're staggering. They're breathtaking. They fly pretty early, and I noticed them mostly in these ridgetop swales. So these areas where where there's a depression on one side of a ridge line that maybe that accumulates snow, it stays wetter, but it certainly isn't like tree covered. A lot of these areas where I was seeing vidlers, they are the same areas that are being encroached by trees in the Olympics. So the tree line in the Olympics isn't as rigid or as strong as in many other ranges. It's mostly has to do with snowpack, and some to do with dryness or irradiation. So the tree line is changing rapidly in the Olympics. And looking at historical photographs, you can see trees are now growing in many places that were completely free of trees in the 1950s and 60s. And I think that many of these alpine butterflies are going to be threatened by this change. Their habitats are going to be threatened by it. But it was particularly notable to me that the vidlers, I seemed like I only ever saw it kind of in these tunnels of along a ridge line with trees coming up on either side. This was one that it was really hard to get a photograph of at all. It almost never sits down, and as these surveys go on, it's going to be difficult for me to accurately characterize like how many I saw. I mean, I don't know how you would design a survey around something that's so erratic and difficult to. I mean, I can say that I saw one, but it's just difficult to get a photograph of. So you're going to need a more complicated survey methodology than just taking a photo of every butterfly you see when you're dealing with a butterfly that flies as fast and refuses to settle down as much as this one. I had a couple observation of vidlers that I was really proud of. One was in the Hamma Hamma. It's on the summit of Mount Stone. And there was a pair nectaring on Sitka valerian. That was further south than I knew about it having been observed in the Olympics before. This is out of that. This was not in that northeastern part of the park where most of the observations of these species are. This is far south of there, north of Mount Eleanor, but kind of in the middle there. So that felt like it was filling in a blank spot on the map for this species. That you could intuit that this species is probably throughout the northeastern half of the park, but to kind of put observations on the map and really fill it in, that was the primary motivation for this work. I also had an observation like that near Lake Crescent on Aurora Ridge, which I don't think was an area that had ever been surveyed for this kind of thing, and was very gratifying to see a butterfly as special as this one. Another species that I'm just really motivated to understand better is the spring white. I observed this species 3 times, twice on Hurricane Ridge and once in the Dungeness. And I'm confident that it nectars on these rock cresses. But rock cresses are so taxonomically challenging that I'm very motivated to go back next year and more accurately identify which species of rock cress they are nectaring on in the Olympics. And maybe I can find larvae on them as well. This is another butterfly that's just so active. It was really challenging. Even when I found when they were flying and where they're flying, it was really difficult to get a photograph of them. I think that there's rock cresses in most of the park, but they fly quite early, and it's really difficult to get to those places early. Many people are probably aware of this, but the presence of this species in the Olympics is fascinatingly disjunct. It's separated. It doesn't occur in the Cascades, to my knowledge, and its occurrence in the Olympics is especially interesting and exciting. So I would really love to collaborate with anybody who wants to do sequencing on this species to try and see how the Olympics populations are related to other populations. This is another like classic special butterfly of the Olympics is the Crixus. I was able to get quite a few observations of this species, which is really exciting. I mean, my goal with a lot of these more uncommon or poorly observed species in the Olympics is that my dream would be if I could generate like a series for these species just of photographs. So a series of photographs that encompasses the variability within the Olympics populations and allows somebody to compare them to other populations, just like you would with pin specimens. But because it's the wilderness, because it's Olympic National Park, collecting that many specimens is just it's really not feasible. And so I think the best way to really get a good sense for the variability of the Olympics populations to other ones is to get as many great photographs of them as I can. And I was happy to do that with the Crixus. So I also saw this one on top of Mount Stone after I'd climbed it with my friend, and that was really exciting to see the Crixus along with the Fiddlers on the top of the mount, literally the summit block. It was fantastic. It was really exciting. I'm not sure what they're nectaring on in the Olympics. I noticed this kind of interesting thing. This could be old hat to anybody in this group, but the Crixus I felt like would do this kind of asynchronous wing beating sometimes, where it felt like it was, instead of beating its wings like other butterflies, I felt like it was, the wings were tracking each other in a really interesting way I couldn't figure out. It also has this really fascinating distribution, or like its presence in the Olympics is really different and notable. It's not present in the nearby ranges. Because it lives in the scree at the top of mountains in the Olympics, it's highly likely to be impacted by climate change. So I put this picture with one of my slide that says where in my talk I am, because I love this moth so much. This is a McCulloch's Forester moth. And I had no idea that this species existed. I was looking for butterflies, and this thing flew by like I don't know what, like a giant bee or something. It was very charismatic and engaging. They were doing kind of male territorial displays and defending like a patch of strawberry on this old road up at Hurricane Ridge. And I can't find any research on it. I mean, it's noted. I know that the species exists, but I don't know anything about the life history of this species. On iNaturalist, it had only been observed a handful of times. I mean, I guess I don't trust this. I felt like I was observing the species in the Olympics, and they were some of the first observations on iNaturalist from the Olympics. So once I started seeing it, I kept seeing it, and I saw it in different parts of the range, and it's just such a bizarre, beautiful day flying moth. I really think it deserves more attention, and I hope other people start photographing it and putting it on iNaturalist because it's just amazing. I was hiking in Badger Valley out at Obstruction Point Road, and this was in September, and you saw this fireweed covered in these beautiful caterpillars. So I took as many photographs as I could, and I went home, and they were this forester moth that I had been so taken by at Hurricane Ridge. This was just, 5 or 10 miles away, and there was the larva like covering this fireweed. So that was just so cool. And I saw him nectaring on Biz Tour. Anybody who went to the LEPSOC meeting last weekend knows that the taxonomy of these sulfurs is complex, but I'm pretty sure I accurately characterized the sulfurs I saw in the Olympics as the Western sulfur. I think that this is really interesting. The Western sulfur I've found is very site specific. As far as I can tell, that the larval host, the Lathyrus, is more widespread. I see that in many locations, but there are only a couple locations where I find the sulfur in the Olympics. And that's really interesting to me. I think I would assume it would be more widely distributed than it is. There's one location up at Hurricane Ridge this summer where I just saw hundreds and hundreds of them on this day. They were by far the most abundant butterfly I saw out at Hurricane Hill. And the fact that it could be so uncommon throughout most of the range, and then at this just like one very specific site be the hugely abundant, by far the most common butterfly. That was just such an interesting idea to me, and really opens the question for me about what makes that site special. What are these? I want to know more about the life history of that population, and to try and connect it to other populations in the Olympics if it's that site specific. Then I saw a couple of these silver spots. This is a really interesting species for me. I only made a couple observations of the silver spots in the Olympics. A couple that I saw that were known to exist were up at Obstruction Point, at the end of Obstruction Point Road. And these species are alpine, so they're high. This is above 5,000 feet. They're in rocky scree, and that's been documented by other people in the Olympics, certainly before. But I talked about this at the Butterfly Association this summer. I think it was in August. But I also found a silver spot that I presume is also a Bremner's, but I would love to know more, that was in a completely different habitat. So this is growing at the bottom of the Elwha, below 2,000 feet in elevation, in the middle of old growth, in this incredibly special meadow, this bog. So that habitat is just so unique and fascinating. The fact that I found this very special butterfly present in that place as well was so gratifying and thrilling, and made this work like totally justified all of the weight of carrying the camera around everywhere in the backcountry and doing all those trips. So it's just like, oh my God, this is why I do it, right? It's to find this very special butterfly in this incredibly special place that nobody had ever surveyed for any insects at all. So I am fascinated by that population, and I'm going to go back next summer, certainly, and try and learn more about it. I also knew that the macaque hopper was a really important species in the Olympics, and something I wanted to better understand. I knew it had been a long time since anybody had looked at that population, and so in coordination with the park, I did some surveys looking at this population out at Ozette. I took photographs of more than 100 individuals. As I mentioned before, my intent was to generate as high quality of a photographic series as I could for this population, so that we could analyze the phenotypic variability without taking undue number of specimens from such an isolated population. I found that it persists in many of the same locations that I was at, that Bob Pyle found it in 1975 when he first observed the species. But there are dramatic changes in the vegetation community of these sites. In general, like, these areas are these fens flowing through dense forest. They were called prairies originally, or historically they've been referred to as the Ozette prairies. However, today the prairie habitat were these upland areas that surrounded fens. And almost all of those upland areas have been encroached by vegetation, leaving just isolated pockets of suitable upland habitat surrounding these much wetter fen areas that still support the butterfly. So one very interesting thing I found about these populations is that Bob Pyle had described in earlier work, much earlier work, like in around 2000, that a skipper that was also present in these areas. And He briefly called it the ozette skipper, and today it's probably better seen as a population of woodland skippers. But the important thing is that it's almost entirely extirpated. And that's probably because those upland areas that surrounded the bogs are almost entirely gone. They've transitioned from these grassy, open, dry, almost rocky substrate to dense salal, hemlock, ledum is the bog labrador that grows out there, and these vegetation has replaced the habitat that formerly supported these skippers. So even though it's the skippers that are out there are not they're not uh, as special of a or as unique of a species as the macaque hopper population, I think it really deserves attention that the habitat changes at the site have displaced one of the very few butterflies that lives out there. The fact that I only observed one in about a dozen site visits and surveys I conducted up there. I only observed one of these skippers out there, and I didn't manage to get a photograph of it or catch it. That's notable. So I hope that I'm able to follow up on that more. I did get a lot of really beautiful photographs of the copper, though. This is one that I wanted to show to this group because I would love anybody's opinions on what's going on here. One of the wings, this this left hind wing, is kind of displaced, and it's a totally different color. It's like this ashy gray, and I don't mean to spin off or speculate out of turn, but I wonder about the small size of this population. I wonder if it's more likely that you get kind of like bottleneck effects or more like aberrant individuals in such a small and isolated population as these macaque hoppers. One really exciting butterfly, or I'm sorry, totally different insect that I want to highlight is the Olympic grasshopper. The grasshoppers in the Olympics, the Olympic grasshopper uh, is an endemic of the Olympic Mountains. It's extremely poorly studied. As I was just reading before this talk, the first photograph of it was only taken in 2008. Um, it hasn't been studied at all, and it only lives in these rocky areas above tree line in the Olympics. I've documented it throughout the northeastern half of the park, but before this, it was seen primarily just up at around Hurricane Ridge and in I guess the first observation was from Mount Eleanor. So there's a paper by somebody that was at my graduate, another professor at Western Washington University where I did my graduate work. Eric Duchesne published a paper on rare and endemic plants of the Olympics being impacted by climate change. So the gist of this paper was basically that these plants that live on ridgelines in the high Olympics, they don't have anywhere to go. If the climate is warming, in many areas, they can move to a higher elevation where there's more snowpack and they're able to be in a cooler climate. But the Olympics are so low, they don't have anywhere to run to. So this work hasn't been done yet, but I would really like to better characterize the distribution of the species, see how low it exists, because it's likely to be impacted in the same way that those rare plant communities are. But having said that, I found it in a lot of different places, and I found some really incredible examples. This individual, I saw this more than once, but it was just really blue. You know, the typical coloration, I'm going to go back, is kind of this like cougar colored or like green brown. And this was in the moraine of the Anderson Glacier. So someplace that was under 100 feet of ice only 30 years ago. Now that ice is entirely gone. It's left this brand new moonscape. It's being colonized by plants and insects. And in that area, I observed these Olympic grasshoppers with this striking blue phenotype that I thought was just so cool, so gratifying and exciting. I'm getting to the end here. I'm going to wrap up by saying that I also observed some introduced species in the backcountry. I observed the western honeybee at Obstruction Point and at Aurora Ridge. Those are two areas that are a really long way from domestic like beekeepers. So what the heck happened there? Did they get caught on the wind? It's with much further from um, from hives than they're known to travel when they swarm. Um, it's possible that these Western honeybees could be bringing domestic parasites or diseases with them, although that's really less concerning to me than the fascination of how the heck did they get there? Out at the end of Obstruction Point Road, that's 5,000 feet higher than Port Angeles and like 15 miles from the nearest beehive. So is there a sequence of feral hives that goes all the way up the drainage and eventually gets to these populations in the subalpine? Did a swarm hang on the bottom of a car? I mean, I found like a hive. So this wasn't just a single individual. This was an area where there was obviously a feral hive in Badger Valley, and then also I observed that in Aurora Ridge above Lake Crescent. So that was really interesting and something I'd love to follow up on. I went back to the hive that I saw in Badger Valley. Observed the hive in 2023 in Badger Valley. I went back there 2024 and it wasn't there anymore. So they'd obviously died over the winter. I saw the hive at Aurora Ridge this summer. So I'll have to go back there next summer and see if that population persisted. I observed a cabbage white like far up the Dungeness, near the headwaters of the Dungeness. I think that's the first observation of a cabbage white in like the middle of the park. So it's not surprising. Cabbage white does well almost anywhere, but it is poking its nose up into the middle of the park. And I have a couple observations of other introduced species like the seven-spotted lady beetle and the drone fly that are widespread, and I think nobody would be surprised that these things are making their way into the middle of the park. So in the future, I really want to get a better camera. I'm inspired by people in this group who have just incredible cameras, and I would love to take better photos. There are some species that I think are just so important and haven't been studied at all, like the grasshoppers at the Olympics. And these Edith's checker spots, I think, are fascinating. I would love to do more work on them next year and follow up with me because I'm going to be working on that. And as I mentioned, these surveys are so focused on butterflies. I'm really interested in incorporating other survey methodologies: moth lights, pitfall traps, malaise trapping, pan trapping, beating sheets, and even acoustic monitoring. This comes from a researcher named Graham Montgomery, who has this great publication that looks at if you're going to design a monitoring protocol for insects, try and do all these different survey methodologies. So I'm looking at that. Something else that I just heard about at the Lepidoptera Society meeting last weekend was this moth box. This is an incredible, like, mind-bending technology. It is a set. You have to put this thing together on your own. The pieces cost about $400, but it's a protocol these researchers have put together to make your own battery-powered autonomous camera that would take photographs of moths as they come past the light all night long, and then analyze all those photographs, pull the moths out of them, and create species observations all autonomously. So obviously this is a complicated thing. You couldn't just dump a billion observations of moths onto iNaturalist just like that. But it's the sort of like totally revolutionary and exciting new technology that I think is going to just really open up the study of insects in the backcountry. Because if we could incorporate these awesome new survey techniques, I think it could be very powerful. I'm conscious of what time it is, and I'll just quickly note that there are some areas that were just, and this was my intent, I'd say I fulfilled my goal in finding places that are so special and unique in the backcountry that I just have to go back there and survey more. One of them is this location in the Upper Elwha, where I observed that silver spot, that the center of the park. It's in the middle of 800, 1200-year old growth forest. Here's this meadow full of forbs with silver spots in it. Like, you can't get this anywhere else on Earth. It's just so exciting and encouraging, so I have to go back there. There's some other places that I need to look at. North-facing meadows are likely to be disproportionately impacted by decreasing snowpack in the Olympics, whereas south-facing meadows are likely to be kept open by summer dryness and heat. The north-facing meadows, if we get less snow hanging on, those areas are likely to be encroached by trees. So any insect communities that live in those north-facing meadows, I've got to get out there and survey them very soon because they won't be around forever. I think I put a slide in here about these burned areas. I was just down the trail from that Boston bog where that last photo was the area in the Upper Elwha that burned last summer. Excuse me, in 2023, 2 years ago. And it looks incredible. It was just, I mean, it looks so beautiful. It looks like the perfect, it looked like a very natural fire in the Upper Elwha. And I would love to survey it more because I think we're going to have to characterize how the natural fire regime in Olympic National Park impacts the species communities that live there. And anybody could put together, like riparian corridors are likely to have a disproportionate amount of species. So those are going to be important to survey as well. I just going to note this. I would love to talk to anybody watching this. I would love to talk to you more about iNaturalist, how to use it better, how to make the highest quality observations you can. The important things are to take good photos. It's not worth putting up low quality photos on iNaturalist. If you want to be actually doing research that's going to be valuable to people or contributing observations that are going to be valuable, you need to be able to look at very detailed characteristics about these organisms in order to identify them. So take very high quality photos, only put up the very best photos, get the accuracy right, and try and put in as much metadata about that observation as you can. I really want to encourage people in this group who are knowledgeable about insects to be reviewers on iNaturalist, because that's how we're going to make this a very useful and a high quality database. As I say here, it's a collaborative tool. It's as useful as we make it. So try and review if you are knowledgeable. Some people are just superstars on there. Stuart is like so active on iNaturalist. It's one of the reasons that we have a pretty good map proportion of the observations in our region are research grade, is because Stuart has taken the time to go through them. So if you're a researcher, try working with iNaturalist data. It exports really well. It's easier to use than you probably think, and it's easier to find high quality information from it than you might think. So I also wanted to mention you can mark bad observations. You can kick them out if you think it's not something that's possible to identify. It's easy to weed out those observations too. So with that, I don't have anything else. I would love to answer anybody's questions. I have some pretty pictures in here in the end, but thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Carter. It's really wonderful. Your enthusiasm is really infectious. There are a couple questions in the chat. Scott, would you like to unmute and ask your two questions directly?
Sure, thank you. Really interesting presentation, Carter. Appreciate your spending the time to do this. I met a fellow in Port Angeles last summer who said, and I looked at some of his entries on iNaturalist, but he said he thought he was had the most observations in the North Olympic Peninsula. He goes, he goes by Robogenesis on iNaturalist. So I thought you look like maybe you know him, but anyway, he's a very good photographer, and I think he'd be somebody interesting for you to follow and maybe connect with, because he's got a very sharp eye. So
Absolutely. I've seen that person on iNaturalist, and it seemed like they had to live in Port Angeles because so many of their observations were from this area, but I don't know them yet. That's sort of the exciting beauty of iNaturalist, I think, is that some of your neighbors are also really interested in the same things you are. But thank you, Scott.
sure. Have you explored the area around Mount Muller, which is just west of Lake Crescent, the ridge line that separates the straits from the Solduck Valley? There are some really good looking combinations of balds and meadows, south facing, from Mount Muller down to like Clochey Nonich. And I think that would be a great area to explore. It's a healthy hike, although I think you can drive logging roads from the north to access that area.
Yeah, I would be fascinated. I did not know that there were so I've done surveys up there for spotted owls. I've worked in that area. It's really interesting to me. There are some pockets of forest up there that haven't been disturbed, and that's really exciting. I have never been into balds or open areas in that area. Um, I It would be amazing to see. I mean, not so far east of there are balds and open areas with Taylor's checker spots on them. I don't know. Has anybody looked up there? I'm not sure, but I have been to Clochey and that road is a bear to drive up, but once you get up there, the view is unbelievable. So that's a great tip. Mount Mueller is where I saw for the first time a a cicada in the middle of the old growth. This huge insect flew right at me and then started buzzing like crazy on the ground. And I almost screamed. I was so surprised. And of course, it was a cicada. I just didn't think of cicadas in the Olympic Mountains. It's just not really part of your classic fauna of the Olympics.
So this is the time anybody can unmute and ask questions. So feel free to do that before, while you're thinking of your questions. I wanted to ask Scott to follow up with another question about permits.
Oh, yes. So you mentioned the possibility of, I can't remember which butterfly it was, but doing some sequencing on it. And I was just curious if you'd attempted to obtain a collecting permit from Olympic National Park. I know that they're sticklers and not very generous at giving out those permits. I tried to get one early last summer for the Washington Bee Atlas, and I struck out. So I was just curious if you'd had any experience with that.
Yeah, I do have a research permit through the park. On it, uh, I was very conservative about collecting. And I made it very clear that collecting was not my intent and that collecting would be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. And I think I knew that that was going to be necessary to receive a research permit because I had worked in the park, and I know kind of how the system, the people who run Olympic National Park or who evaluate the permits, they know what they have. They have this resource that is totally unique and special, and they're understandably protective of that. So in order to receive a research permit, which by the book, you need a research permit for any systematic collection of information in the park. But I did put on there, I tried to open the possibility that if there were collaborating researchers who wanted specimens, that I would be able to run that past them on a case-by-case basis. And and after some conversations, that was fine. I didn't collect. I only collected organisms in one case where there was a researcher who was going to be sequencing that, and so I ran it past them, and it went fine. But in general, I would just say that it would benefit anyone looking to do work in the backcountry of the Olympics to think about non-lethal ways that they could collect as much information as possible about their target organisms. They would probably be more amenable to non-lethal sampling like sequencing a hind leg, things like that. But when it comes to bees, what comes to mind is like chilling. I mean, that's something I've always wanted to do is chill bees and then take really high quality photographs of them. I've tried to put a bunch of bee observations on iNaturalist, but you just need so many photographs from so many angles to get good identifications that it's really a bear to try and get a useful photographic identification of a bee. So I can understand why you'd be motivated by that.
So did you have to observe the bee or whatever it was that you were interested in getting a DNA sample for, and then go to the park and talk to people and then go back and collect? Is that the process? Or were you able to make that decision on your own in the field?
I was out there to collect that species specifically. I don't want to be too cagey about it, but it was a sequencing project where somebody had said we were interested in looking at the genetics of this species, and I ran that past everybody first, and then I went out there specifically to collect a couple individuals for sequencing. So that was kind of like premeditated collection.
Got it.
Hey, Carter.
Hey, JP.
Yeah, you know that silver-spotted fritillary you showed earlier, and you talked about them. That caused quite a stir when you presented them 2 months ago, and it's grown, as you well know, since then. People are talking about it. It's a very interesting thing. You and I can't remember the young lady's name that got one also.
Yep.
Yeah.
It might have been me. So
Okay.
are you talking about the silver spot?
Yeah.
Yeah, the Bremner, yeah.
Yeah, that turned out to be really, really interesting because of not only in a very unusual habitat, but they're unusual in appearance. I mean, they contrast with the populations that are alpine at or above alpine habitat. So this is an ongoing, very interesting situation, and you guys started it. You started it, both of you.
Yeah, thank you, John. Yeah, it is really fascinating. And that is an example of a population where, I mean, I've discussed with other researchers going back next summer and catching, chilling individuals and taking just the best photographs I possibly can of them. But I've also thought about how it would be useful to collect a leg, maybe. I don't expect that population is very big. In general, if I'm collecting anything, I'm going by like this rule of thumb I heard about in botany, where you're collecting less than 5% of the individuals you observe at that site that day. So I don't know if I see, if I see 100 or something, then that would open the door to collect a couple. But I think with a population that interesting and unique, collecting like one leg and doing sequencing on that is something I'd be interested in, and something that I'm looking for collaborators who would be up for doing the sequencing on.
Well, you've actually done a lot of really good photographic work. You don't think you have great photographs, but those Edith checker spots are actually very, very informative. And, I've led people to them, and they all are able to see. Before you had those series well, you and other people had these photographed. We didn't really know what they were, right? So now we're in a position where you may end up describing them. And that will be another case where you will need to have specimens for the holotype, et cetera.
And I think that the EDIS, the case is a lot easier made. There are locations I worked this summer where I was like, okay, well, I'm seeing, in the last hour hiking up this ridgeline, I saw a couple hundred. And so I think that I'm well within my my kind of self limitations to collect several of these individuals, do that in several different locations, and try and generate a series for the park. But that would be another case where if I'm collecting, then I'm going to be putting that in my permit next year and making sure that I'm staying in the good graces of everybody associated with approving my permit at the park.
So Karen, did you have anything else to add?
Sure. Hi, Carter. This is Karen Holtrop.
Hi, Karen.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. This is awesome. As you know, I've done some butterflying in the Olympics, in the Olympic National Forest, though. And so it's just, like Mount Townsend and whatnot. But yeah, a few of the species you've mentioned, I've seen up at Townsend or Tubal-Cain, like Bremner's, the silver spot quite a bit, including this past summer at a bit lower down elevation, 3,000 feet.
Yeah.
Or so, usually they've been higher up. But yeah, Crixus Arctic and Vidler's Alpine up at Mount Townsend. I agree with, was it Scott who said to go to Mount Muller? That's a good idea. Yeah, up there would be great. I was actually just in that area today. I didn't go up in the Alpine.
Well, that's fantastic.
But I was just out there.
Were
I
you in
live
the snow?
though, but yeah, I haven't been up to Mount Muller that much in the Alpine, but I did go there a few years ago. We didn't see very many butterflies, but yeah, it would be a good place to check out. I agree with that.
Yeah.
What were you
So
doing
yeah,
today, Karen?
get together sometime. But I have one question. So you mentioned seeing a whole bunch of Western sulfurs, I think,
Yeah,
at Hurricane Hill. Do you
that's
remember
right.
when that was? What date that was?
Um,
About approximately.
it was in July.
Okay.
I it's definitely, if you go to my iNaturalist, um, there's like an Insects of Olympic National Park project that I made, and that just
Okay.
siphons in every single insect observation. But yeah, if you go on there, it's one day where I made like I think 15 or 20 observations of Western sulfurs from the Hurricane Hill Trail, and it's actually west of Hurricane Hill, at a spot that people call Lunch Rock. So it's on
Okay.
that Hurricane Hill to Elwha Trail. There's these
Yeah.
huge south-facing meadows that are really, I mean, maybe I overstated how surprised I was to see that many sulfurs there, because it's a very special habitat. I mean, it's probably snow-free almost the whole winter. It gets so much, it's so south-facing and so big, it must
Right.
melt out so early. Um, so yeah, it was, I think mid-July.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah.
Hey, Carter, you mentioned the prairie where you observed the macaw copper and the woodland skippers, and I was curious. I think you said it was by Ozette. Was that by any chance Alstrom's Prairie?
Yeah. So that's one of the locations that has that community.
Okay, I haven't been there in probably over 20 years, but I think I had heard somewhere that and some other prairies in the neighborhood are dwindling.
Yeah, and it's complex because they're made up, they're not really a prairie, they're these they're this combination of different rare habitat types. So they have sphagnum bogs, upland vegetation, and then a fen running down the middle. So that happens 3 or 4 different times out there where you have part of it is sphagnum bog, part of it is fen. And then part of it is these upland areas, which it's my interpretation, those upland areas are only open because of cultural burning practiced by the macaw and subsequently practiced by settlers out there and by them grazing their sheep out there. So it's this incredibly special community type that probably dates back to immediately after the last glacial maxima, when there weren't any trees out there. And they were probably has been maintained for thousands and thousands of years to keep this open, treeless space. Because it sounded like you have a particular interest in bees. I saw it's on iNaturalist like a fog belt bumblebee out there.
Mm.
Which I don't really know enough about bees to say how special that was. But when somebody chimed in and helped me ID that bee I observed out there, that was really special. That's an area that is so special, unique, and isolated that I would really dissuade. It sounds like I'm saying I'm the only one who gets to have fun, but like I would dissuade people from exploring off of the trail there. You can see almost all of the habitat types, plants, and in community associations there from the boardwalk trail out to Cape Alava. And I would encourage people if they go there to observe, to stick to the trail or stick to the forest margin, and not to walk through the middle of those prairies because that's the only place on Earth where the macaw copper lays its eggs, the only place on Earth where it lives. And the boardwalk is just so convenient. You can observe these species, and keep your feet dry and have no impact on the habitat out there.
Okay, any other questions, comments, thoughts? So you're talking about trails and exploring and wondering if you might be interested in the possibility of leading some sort of group, Carter?
I would love to lead a foray next summer in the Olympics. I think it would be fantastic. It would have to be without nets, but there are so many places we could go. I would love to get people's input, help to identify special things in the Olympics that I'm missing, and there's a couple of places that come to mind we could go to that would be all accessible from Port Angeles by car. Most of it's going to be in that northeast area where other people have surveyed, but there's places like Blue Mountain. I don't think that anybody could look enough. Last year, there was this the Western white, that I found on top of Blue Mountain that Meryl and Caitlin helped me identify on iNaturalist, and it was really perplexing to me. But there's just like there's so many special plant associations in that area, that it really deserves as much attention as it can get. So I would love to go up there with a group and look around.
Oh, that sounds terrific. Allison, do you want to unmute and ask your question, please? You don't, it's free, everybody can just chime in, so go ahead and ask her.
Okay, hi Carter.
Hi, Allison.
Good to see you. So on the forest, we're able to do some habitat work with these areas and like have the WCC out or Northwest Youth Corps and take down encroaching trees and things. And I was wondering if the park is able to do that too, or prescribe burning, or is the park's philosophy more just let natural processes go?
Allison, were you involved in the restoration work up the Dungeness on that bog? Is that what you're referring to?
No, more just more I've done this on the Willamette, but Karen can chime in. I know that the Olympic National Forest has done,
Yes.
like there's a kind of a prairie area
Yeah, I've been
south.
Yeah, Carter, I've been involved with that for years.
I've read your work on that. It's really impressive and amazing. I'm so sorry that I'm forgetting the name of the bog, but yeah, the bog up the lower Dungeness, that it was just a slam dunk. It looks like
Oh, the
so well.
cranberry bog.
Yes, yes.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, so that's another species, Beller's ground beetle, the first site on the Olympic Peninsula.
I've been keeping an eye out for it, but I haven't come up with one yet.
Oh, yeah, they're kind of specific to sphagnum bogs, but if you ever want to go to cranberry bog, let me know.
I will. Yeah.
Yeah, I got to go this summer and I did get a photo of a macaque. Well, a Mariposa copper. I don't
Yeah,
know
they're
if it
not-
fits in the
they're-
macaque area, but
Yeah, they're considered the cascade subspecies now, not macaw anymore, but yeah.
Allison, I have to be a little bit cagey about this specific question. I'll just say that it's in discussion right now, and
okay.
it's so complicated and precarious that that I don't want to say anything about it.
Yeah, that's okay.
But in general, the park is constrained by the Wilderness Act. So when it comes to things like this, there are groups who are who seek to protect the wilderness, and they do that by through litigation with the park. So there are often cases where if the park overplays its hand, or the park does some management action, there are groups that will seek to hold the park accountable about that and
Oh,
keep
okay.
them in check. So without saying anything more about it, it is difficult for the Park Service to engage in that sort of restoration work far more than, in my experience, Karen, than it is in the Forest Service. It's really challenging in the park.
Yeah, and then I'm sure you've talked to Karen, but she has a couple of bumblebee atlas. What are those called now? Like specific
Plots.
areas. So we have a couple of those on the forest.
Bumblebee Atlas monitoring sites, but also, I mean, we have a number of just Olympic National Forest bumblebee monitoring locations. Yeah. We found
That's-
Western bumblebee,
That's fantastic. And
a few.
that's the sort of thing that I would love to see established in the park, and yeah, I found a Western bumblebee up the Skoke at the top of the Skoke last year. So that was exciting.
Cool.
Oh, okay, great.
I'm sure they're everywhere. I mean, I'm sure I used to work with somebody named JD Herndon, who was a bumblebee expert, and he had a research firm too. He was finding them all over the place.
Well, there are quite a few found in the Dungeness watershed from sea level up, all the way up to, like 6,000 feet or something, over 5 anyways, high elevation. Alpine. And so, but we've looked a lot and we have not found them widespread. Just only, mostly in the Dungeness and then also in the Big Quill Seam drainage.
Wow.
Including in the large metropolis of Quilcene.
Yeah, the Pearl of the Peninsula.
Yeah.
I love Quilcene. It's my favorite place.
Well, do you know that little community garden that's so pretty?
Of course.
Yeah, we found one there.
Really? That's amazing.
I know.
That's so surprising to me. That's fantastic.
Does it have both natives and ornamental species, Allison?
Yeah, it's the community garden's an interesting group of species. So they've got some little shrubs and all kinds of flowers of many types, and vegetables they put in there. So this one was on a cosmos.
Wow, that's awesome. I had no idea. I mean, it's for anybody listening, it's like 5 feet away from Highway 101. It's not like this is not the middle of some huge, beautiful park. That's awesome.
So there's also, just go to Squim, you can find, I've found Western bumblebees at the Costco parking lot, Starbucks, Harry Blake Park, a lavender farm, the one that's on Case Road, as well as the Dungeness, the county park
Yeah,
at, yeah, at Dungeness. And so,
awesome.
yeah. Good place to see them.
Okay, any other questions, comments, thoughts? All right, I don't see any other questions in the chat, so I want to thank you so much, Carter, for bringing your research work to us and for all the work you've done and all your enthusiasm. It's really terrific to see.
Of course. I love it. I love this group. It's been so motivating for me. And I really encourage anybody who's interested in following up, reach out to me, and I would love to speak with you.
Yeah, Carter, you did good, man. I love this. And it's like somebody said, the enthusiasm is infectious. It was tonight, and then at the Pacific workshop. It was like really good to have you down there too. It's good to have dinner with the shepherds, wasn't it?
It's not bad at all. The dinner was incredible. Yeah. Yeah, it was a huge treat. So I'm very lucky.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And then we'll have our next meeting on, I think it's December 4th, the first Wednesday. Don't have a speaker lined up yet, but we'll get that organized. And then in January, we'll have our winter holiday and then resume our regular programs in February with Gary Bernard talking about some of his research. So, okay, well, thank you so much. And everybody, I hope you all have a good evening.
Thanks.
Good night.